Baroni.
Yeah, well, here we are, the very first act of this government in the 51st Parliament. And what is it? Surprise, surprise, it's dealing to hard-working New Zealanders. That's the very first thing. They have suspended the address and reply debate to deal to the working people of New Zealand. It's a disgrace, and they are reverting to type. And in part one, this is where the rubber hits the road. This is where it's all happening. Because what is the urgency that this is the very first act of this new government? What is the urgency in this? What is the harm that they are aiming to fix up? Well, Mr. Chair, in determining and in weakening collective bargaining, who is it that this government could be going after in such one hell of a hurry? Well, I'm looking at some of the collective agreements that are about to expire.
Wow.
Nurses, public hospital nurses, that's who they're after, because they are negotiating their employment agreement right now. Right now. And that is who they are after. It is the nurses who actually look after people when they end up in the public hospital that this government is going after. Why else would this be the very first act that they have undertaken as a new government? And then after the nurses come the teachers. The teachers' collective employment agreement is up about the middle of next year, and that's who they're going to have in their sights next. That is why they have suspended a debate to try and force this through. Nurses, teachers, police will be next, firefighters will be after that, and they are after each and every single one of them. So when nurses and teachers and firefighters and police and anyone on a collective agreement thinks about the vote that they may have cast during the election, they need to know what the very first act is that this government is taking against their interests. Because the only reason for weakening collective bargaining, and it is weakening collective bargaining in part one, Mr. Chair, is to drive down wages. That's the only reason to do it. And they say, oh, rubbish, but what is the reason? What is the harm that we're trying to fix here? Is it because we have had lots of long and bitter industrial disputes where workers have demanded unrealistic wages and gained them? Is that what's been happening in New Zealand? I haven't seen any of that. In fact, what I have seen, though, Mr. Chair, is a report in the New Zealand Herald earlier this week where a Sky City worker got up at the AGM and talked about how she's a sole parent, working 2 days a week, trying to make ends meet, actually doing what the government wants, actually in paid employment instead of being on the benefit. 2 days a week, she, after I think 17 years or 11 years, I'm one of those two, it might have been 11 years of service with Sky City, without any consultation, was cut down to 1 day a week. 1 day a week at the minimum wage to try and exist on. She got up in that shareholders meeting, she told her story to a group of shareholders who were just about to vote in an increase in directors' fees for Sky City. That's what's been going on in this country. We've got growing inequality. There have been wage movements, all right, but they've been for directors and CEOs, where we know now that the increase, the difference between people on the average wage in organisations and their CEOs, that gap has grown hugely under this government. And that's what this is designed to do. It's designed to make that even worse than what it is under the current government. And that is not the New Zealand that I think and that the Labour Party believes we ought to have. We actually don't think it's fair that CEOs keep getting huge increases while this government passes this sort of legislation for no reason. Where is the harm? Where is the dispute? And I want the members opposite to get up and name the dispute where workers have won an unreasonable wage increase because there has been a duty to conclude collective bargaining. Minister, I challenge you to get up and name that dispute where workers have won an unfair wage increase because the legislation currently requires a duty to conclude collective bargaining. And if there is no such dispute, if there is no such example, then why is the government taking this as its very first act? Well, I'll tell you why, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, it's because they are after, Mr Chair, it's because they are after the hard-working nurses. They are after our very valuable teachers. And I listened very carefully to Stephen Joyce earlier this week when he said, well, because I'm interested to know what's in the kind of dark minds, in the recesses of the dark minds of the National Party. That's why I listened to him. And he talked about the tertiary sector, tertiary education sector. And you know what he said? He said their costs have increased by 70% in the last 10 years. They must get their costs under control. Well, on this side of the House, we all know what that's code for, because in the tertiary sector, they don't have whiz-bag machinery and, lots of capital expenditure in terms of research and development costs and that sort of thing. They spend their money on employing quality people. They spend their money on wages to have the best academic people we can have in our tertiary institutions. And so what Stephen Joyce is saying is that he wants wage cuts. He wants wage cuts, and this is the legislation in part one that they are going to use to bring that about. Mr Speaker, I want to move on to talk about the meal breaks and rest periods part of this bill. It's an issue that's very close to my heart because, in fact, I wrote the current piece of legislation. It was a member's bill that I wrote in my name. It was adopted as a government bill in my first term in Parliament. And so, I take it a little bit personally, but more importantly, the stories that we heard when we passed that legislation were incredible, and that's what we're about to go back to. Because what people said is they couldn't believe that in the year, I think it was 2006 or 2007 when we passed that, 2007, they couldn't believe in the year 2007 that workers in a civilised democracy like New Zealand didn't have the legal right in law to have a lunch break or a rest period. People couldn't believe that, but when they came to hear the stories, and Mr Bennett was on that select committee at the time, I think even they couldn't believe it. That there were people who came before the select committee, told us stories about how they had been sacked. Yes, they had been sacked, Mr Chair, because they dared to take a lunch break in their workplace in the year 2007 in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And that was not just an isolated incident, but the one I remember very clearly was from Hamilton. Young guy by the name of Anaru came and told the select committee about working for Subway in Hamilton, where he agreed, because another worker was sick, he'd done his shift, and he agreed to stay on and do a second shift because another work colleague of his was sick. He did the right thing. He didn't have to agree to it, but he did it. But after he'd done about 10 hours, he started to get pretty tired and fatigued, and he knew he was going to make a mistake if he didn't get a break. He insisted on taking a break, a half-hour meal break, and when he returned, he was sacked. He was sacked for daring to walk off the job. They said he'd abandoned his duty. He'd gone to take a meal break, which brings me to another point. The reason why I wrote that piece of legislation was because of my concern around the health and safety issues associated with fatigue at work. That is the reason why we have the right for a tea break and for a meal break. It's to keep people safe, because we know if people are tired, they will hurt themselves and others. And sometimes that actually ends up in workers losing their lives. And particularly when you think about dangerous industries like forestry, where we know already there is pressure on workers to work without taking their breaks because they are paid on a piecemeal basis rather than on the hours that are worked. We already know that there are actually major health and safety issues going on. And here's the government saying, well, actually, you can bargain away your right to have a meal break. Just don't bother having one. You know, maybe the employer will offer you a chocolate fish, or maybe the employer will just threaten you, as they threatened Anaru, with his job if you insist on taking a meal break. And those are the sorts of things that are going to start happening over and over again if this government has its way. Mr Chair, that legislation, that meal breaks and rest periods legislation that was brought in as part of a government bill that also dealt with infant feeding breaks. I'm going to probably continue this story later on.
Honourable Member David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and it gives me great pleasure to speak on the Employment Relations Amendment Bill.